Winter had taken full hold of the Wyoming mountains. The sky remained a steely gray, and the snow fell in a nearly soundless curtain, covering everything in a suffocating white silence. Jack Monroe, a former soldier turned reclusive forest ranger, rode his horse along a forgotten trail, checking on old structures that could pose danger during a storm like this. It had been weeks since anyone in town had seen him. He preferred it that way, far from the noise and far from the memories. That afternoon, as the wind hissed through the skeletal pines, Jack noticed something unusual. A thin column of smoke rising from the valley below. That shouldn't have been there. The area had been marked abandoned for years, and the old Whitmore cabin had been deemed uninhabitable after a fire partially gutted it 2 winters ago. The place was forgotten, swallowed by trees and time. Jack dismounted carefully, tying his horse to a sturdy pine. The smoke wasn't strong, but it was unmistakable, curling up from a chimney that shouldn't have worked. As he approached, he noticed footprints in the snow. Small ones, light, uneven, child-sized. His heart, usually locked behind the armor of war and solitude, kicked with alarm. The cabin's door creaked when he pushed it open. Inside, the dim light of a dying fire flickered weakly. The room was sparse, half-collapsed from years of neglect, but someone had tried to make it livable. A few blankets were huddled in a corner. A crude doll sat slumped on a broken chair. But what made him freeze in place wasn't the smoke or the mess. It was a sound, a soft, stifled sob. He turned slowly, scanning the room, and spotted her. Curled up behind a toppled cabinet was a little girl, no older than 5, her face smudged with dirt, her eyes wide with fear. Her hair was tangled, her cheeks flushed from cold, and she clutched a crumpled photograph to her chest like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. "Hey," Jack said gently, removing his gloves and kneeling. "I'm not here to hurt you. What's your name?" The girl hesitated, then whispered just loud enough for him to hear. "Clara." He edged closer, careful not to startle her. "Are you alone here, Clara?" She nodded, her lower lip trembling. "Mommy said she'd be right back. She went to get help. She told me to wait." Jack swallowed hard. His eyes flicked toward the fireplace. It was barely alive. The girl had been keeping herself warm with scraps and instinct. How long had she been alone? 2 days? 3? More? She looked like she hadn't eaten in days. Her feet were bare and purple from the cold. Her eyes, though, they were clear, unbroken, still full of hope. "Come on," he said, offering his coat. "Let's get you warm, okay?" Clara hesitated again, but then crawled toward him, slow and uncertain. When he wrapped his thick wool coat around her, she sighed, almost like she was sinking into a dream. Her body was light, too light. He lifted her gently and brought her closer to the fire, stoking the flames with kindling from his satchel. She didn't speak, but she watched him carefully, like she wanted to trust him, needed to, but didn't know how. "You did good," he told her softly. "You stayed here like your mom told you. That's very brave." She gave the tiniest nod. She said if I waited, she'd come back. Jack stared into the fire, feeling something inside him twist. "Do you know where she went?" Clara bit her lip. She said, "The town." She said it wasn't far. Town was nearly 20 miles through snow and broken forest roads. On foot, with this storm, the chances were slim. He reached for a battered tin pot and poured water from his canteen into it, setting it over the fire. With some oats from his pack and the last of his dried apples, he made a simple porridge. Clara ate in silence, her spoon trembling in her tiny hand. That night, Jack didn't sleep. He sat by the fire while Clara curled up under a mound of blankets he found in a chest. She clutched the photo even in sleep. It was a family portrait, faded and creased. A man, a woman, and a little girl in a red dress. "Clara, where are they?" he whispered to no one, staring at the photo. "And why would they leave you?" The only answer was the wind outside, cold and cruel as always. He built up the fire and checked the door twice, scanning the forest beyond. His instinct screamed that something was wrong, not just a mother delayed by weather. Something darker, more permanent. At dawn, Clara woke slowly. She rubbed her eyes and reached for the coat still wrapped around her. Jack crouched beside her. "We'll find your mom," he said. "But we need to go slow. First, we make sure you're strong enough." Clara looked up at him, her eyes full of something that nearly broke him. Trust. Fragile. Earned with quiet care. She didn't ask where her father was. And Jack didn't ask why. The storm held steady as they remained inside the decaying cabin, its walls groaning with each gust of wind that battered the mountainside. Jack spent the morning repairing what he could, propping up fallen beams, nailing shut loose boards, and sealing gaps with blankets and old tarps. It wasn't much, but it would hold. Clara followed him around the cabin like a shadow, too quiet for a child her age. Occasionally she'd speak in whispers, as though the walls might hear them. Jack didn't press her for more information. Something about her silence spoke volumes. When he finally knelt down to tie her shoes, mismatched, too small, and badly worn, she tapped his shoulder. "You smell like pine trees," she said, and it was the first time she smiled. Jack chuckled softly. "That's probably better than how I usually smell." She giggled, covering her mouth with both hands. That small sound, laughter, it stirred something in Jack he thought had died long ago. After a meal of beans and dried jerky, he ventured outside with Clara bundled in layers. The snowfall had lightened, revealing clearer tracks from days past. He studied the trail leading away from the cabin, faint boot prints heading into the woods. He followed them for 100 yards before they disappeared beneath drifts. They were adult-sized, deep, heavy, headed in the direction of town. But then something odd. The trail doubled back. Whoever had left returned. Back at the cabin, Clara was drawing in the soot on a window pane, stick figures in the snow. Jack watched her silently. She didn't seem to notice he'd left. Or maybe she had, and chose not to say anything. That night, as he built a stronger fire, Jack asked gently, "Clara, do you remember what your mommy was wearing?" She nodded. "The blue coat, with the white buttons. Did she leave with anyone?" Clara shook her head. She said Daddy would come later. Jack frowned. "Did your daddy ever show up?" Clara's voice dropped to almost nothing. He was mad. Mommy told him not to come back. Jack's hand paused over the kettle. He turned toward her slowly. "When did she say that?" Clara's fingers played with the edge of the blanket. "Before the fire, before the yelling." His chest tightened. "Did something happen that night?" Clara looked down at her doll, silent. Jack didn't ask again. The fire popped softly beside them, and outside, snow resumed its gentle fall, erasing more of the world beyond. By the next morning, Clara had warmed to him in small but meaningful ways. She sat closer, reached for his hand when frightened by the creaks of the cabin, and asked questions. "Do you have a little girl?" she said, curled beside him. "No," Jack replied. "Not anymore." Clara blinked. "Where did she go?" Jack stared at the flames, his face unreadable. "She got sick, a long time ago." Clara didn't say anything, but she moved closer, resting her head against his side. Jack kept his eyes on the fire, but his hand moved, gentle, steady, to rest over hers. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of understanding neither could explain. Later that afternoon, Jack saddled his horse and built a makeshift sled out of broken furniture. He wrapped Clara in blankets and sat her atop it, her doll tucked under her arm. "We're going to town," he told her. "We'll ask around, see if anyone's seen your mom." Clara nodded bravely, though her grip on the sled tightened. The trail was slow, treacherous in places. Trees loomed like sentinels, and the sky above remained a stubborn gray. They reached the halfway point before sundown and took shelter in an abandoned ranger post. Jack lit a fire in the old stove, while Clara explored the dusty shelves. "Look," she whispered, holding up a wooden bird figurine. "Do you think it flew away before the snow?" "I think it waited for spring," Jack said, laying down a bedroll for her. As she drifted to sleep, he stared at the fire again, haunted by more than the cold. The footprints returning to the cabin. The lack of other signs, the mention of yelling and fire. Something didn't sit right. Someone had come back. Maybe not for Clara, but for something else. The next day, they reached the town of Harlan's End. A scattering of buildings pressed against the mountains like they'd been placed there by accident. Jack carried Clara into the sheriff's office, her small hand wrapped tightly around his. Sheriff Tomlin looked up from his desk, surprised. "Jack Monroe, haven't seen you in months." Jack didn't waste time. "This is Clara. Found her in the old Whitmore place, alone. Said her mother went for help." Tomlin's eyes widened. "Jesus. That place burned. Years back. She's been living there, waiting." The sheriff's expression shifted. "What's her last name?" Jack glanced at Clara. She answered softly, "Grayson. Clara Grayson." Tomlin stood slowly. "Grayson? You sure?" Jack nodded. "That means something to you?" Tomlin walked to a filing cabinet, rifled through old reports, then pulled one out. He handed it over. Jack read it slowly. His hands tightened around the paper. Missing persons. Heather Grayson. Husband, Daniel Grayson. Daughter, Clara. Date, 10 months ago. Jack looked up. 10 months. The sheriff nodded grimly. "Disappeared last spring. Neighbors said there was trouble. Domestic stuff. We searched, but the trail went cold." Jack glanced at Clara, now playing quietly with her doll. She had waited. All this time. "She told me her mom left to get help," Jack said. "Said she'd be back." The sheriff sighed. "We never found her, or him. Until now, we didn't think the girl had survived." Jack's jaw clenched. "We need to find out what really happened." Jack stayed in town that night. Sheriff Tomlin gave them the back room of the station. Warm, modest, and just enough for a cot and a chair. Clara clung to her doll, but she didn't resist when Jack tucked her in and sat by her side until her breathing softened. Outside the office, Tomlin poured a strong cup of coffee and handed it to Jack. "You know, I remember the Graysons. He was a rough one. Drank heavy. Worked odd jobs. The kind of man who thought being feared was the same as being respected." Jack stared at the steam rising from the cup. "Did anyone ever file a report?" "Neighbors talked. Some bruises, screaming at night. But Heather never came forward. Said it would only make it worse. And then one day they're gone," Jack said bitterly. "Just like that," Tomlin replied. "Car gone. House empty. Like they vanished into the trees." Jack leaned back in the chair, his body aching from the trail, but his mind sharper than ever. Except they didn't. They went to that cabin. She was hiding. "And he went after her," Tomlin added. The two men sat in silence for a moment, the truth rising like smoke between them. The next morning, Jack took Clara to the general store. She clutched his hand tightly, but lit up when the storekeeper handed her a piece of wrapped candy. On the house, the old woman smiled. "You got eyes like your mama." Jack's ears perked up. "You knew Heather?" The storekeeper nodded. "Used to come here sometimes. Quiet girl, always polite. Never said much, but the way she moved, like she was always looking over her shoulder." Clara pressed her face into Jack's coat. Jack crouched to meet her gaze. "Do you remember if your mommy ever came here, sweetheart?" Clara hesitated, then nodded. "She bought food and a blanket. I helped carry the apples." The storekeeper confirmed it. "Came through, maybe 5 months back. Said she was going north. Asked if anyone had seen her husband." Jack's heart sank. She was still running. They left with supplies. Dry clothes for Clara, a pair of boots, and a blanket Jack paid for in silence. The town had already begun whispering. A girl lost in the woods, a mother missing, a ranger who didn't speak much but carried something like thunder behind his eyes. That afternoon, Jack returned to the cabin alone, leaving Clara in the care of a local teacher who'd volunteered to look after her. The wind was stronger now, and the snow had begun to melt in patches, revealing the earth beneath. Inside the cabin, Jack searched more thoroughly. He pulled aside broken boards and lifted floor planks, hunting for any clue of what had happened. In the far corner, behind an old stove, he found something half buried in ash, a silver necklace, tangled and scorched. He remembered the photo Clara held. Her mother had worn that necklace. His hands trembled as he picked it up. Behind the cabin he found a place where the snow had sunken strangely. Disturbed soil, old faint burn marks. A fire had been set here, not for warmth, but to erase. He dug with his hands, ignoring the sting of frozen dirt and broken nails until he uncovered the truth. A bone, charred, small. He staggered back, bile rising in his throat. But he kept digging, knowing that what he'd find would confirm what his instincts had already whispered. Heather Grayson hadn't left Clara. She had tried to protect her, and someone had made sure she couldn't come back. Back in town, the news struck Sheriff Tomlin like a hammer. The station fell into a deep silence as Jack placed the bone, wrapped in a cloth, onto the desk. "Jesus," Tomlin whispered. "You think it was him?" Jack nodded. She was trying to disappear. He followed her, and when he found her, he made sure she couldn't leave again. Tomlin swallowed hard. "And the girl?" "She waited," Jack said, his voice tight. "Waited for someone who would never come." A week passed. Investigators confirmed the remains matched Heather Grayson. The report was clear: blunt force trauma, post-mortem burning. Everything pointed to murder. But Daniel Grayson was still missing. Wanted posters went up. The story spread across counties. A man who murdered his wife and left his daughter to die in the cold. It was too horrifying to ignore. And in the midst of it all, Clara held onto Jack's hand wherever they went. She still whispered sometimes, asking if her mommy was coming back. Jack never lied. He told her the truth, that her mother loved her and that love was what kept her alive, but he didn't say the rest. Not yet. One night, Clara crawled onto the cot beside him, her eyes wide in the dark. "Do you think Daddy is still looking for us?" she asked. Jack paused, then said, "I think he's afraid now. Afraid of what we know. Afraid that we're not hiding anymore." Clara was quiet for a long moment, then whispered, "Good." Then she fell asleep with her head on his chest, and Jack felt the weight of a promise settle into his bones. He would not let the past catch her again. And if Daniel Grayson ever came back, Jack would be waiting. Spring crept slowly into the mountains, melting snow and softening the earth beneath the trees. Streams, once frozen, now whispered through the valleys, and the scent of pine began to mix with the first wildflowers daring to bloom. Life was returning to the land, but Jack Monroe wasn't at peace. Every morning, he checked the wanted notices pinned to the sheriff's wall. Every night, he double-locked the doors of the ranger's cabin where he now lived with Clara. She had her own bed in the corner, with a quilt sewn by the teacher who still came to visit twice a week. A drawing she'd made, 3 figures holding hands under a crooked sun, was pinned above the mantel. She had given the tall figure a beard and a hat. She called him Jack, sometimes Papa Jack. He didn't correct her. The town had grown used to the pair, the quiet ranger and the girl who'd once been left for dead in a ruin of ash and memory. Locals dropped off gifts, toys, food, blankets. Someone left a puppy in a box outside the cabin with a note that simply read, "For Clara." She named him Button, but Daniel Grayson remained a shadow on the horizon. Rumors spread, a sighting in Elk River, a brawl in a tavern 2 towns over, a stranger asking questions near the old Grayson house, but nothing solid, nothing that let Jack breathe easier. One night he sat outside the cabin with a rifle across his lap, the stars cold above. Clara came to sit beside him, her bare feet swinging off the edge of the porch. "Will you shoot him?" she asked. Jack turned, startled. "If he comes back," she added. "Will you shoot my daddy?" He set the rifle aside and pulled her close. "Only if I have to. I'd rather he never came at all." Clara didn't cry. She rarely did anymore, but her hand found his and squeezed tight. He used to yell a lot. At Mommy. At me. She'd say he was just tired or sad, but I think he was just mean. Jack didn't answer right away. He watched the wind ripple through the trees and thought of another little girl, one he couldn't protect, one buried far away in a quiet field. "You know," he said finally, "there are some men who think being loud makes them strong, but real strength is quiet. It listens. It protects. Clara leaned her head on his shoulder. Like you. His throat tightened. I try. A few days later, Sheriff Tomlin rode up to the cabin, urgency in his eyes. We got a match, he said. Grayson. A drifter picked up in Big Hollow, gave a false name, but they ran his prints. It's him. Jack stood slowly. Where is he now? County jail, but he's trying to talk his way out. Claims he never laid a hand on his wife. Says you planted the evidence. Jack's jaw tightened. Of course he does. Tomlin nodded. We're filing to bring him back here. Trial will be held in town. Clara was watching from the window. She's going to have to speak, Tomlin added, voice low. They'll want testimony. Jack turned to look at the girl inside, her small frame framed by afternoon light, hair braided, shirt too big. She's 5. I know. Jack rode into town the next day, Clara riding in front of him, her arms around his waist. The town buzzed as they passed. Stares, whispers, a few nods of respect. At the sheriff's office, they met with a woman from the district court, Miss Alder, soft-spoken but sharp-eyed. She brought toys, a notepad, and soft questions. Clara answered them all. Mommy said we were going somewhere safe. She cried at night but told me everything would be better. Daddy came to the cabin. Mommy screamed. I saw her fall. Miss Alder wrote it all down. Jack watched from the other side of the glass. He had never felt so proud, or so afraid. The trial was set for 2 weeks later. Daniel Grayson would be brought in under armed guard, and Clara would have to face the man who took everything from her. Jack didn't sleep that night. He sat on the porch again, staring at the darkness between the trees, wondering what kind of strength it took to walk into that courtroom and speak truth to power. And then he realized she wasn't walking in alone. He was going with her. The courthouse in Harlan's End had never seen such a crowd. Journalists came from neighboring counties, townsfolk packed the benches, and whispers filled the hallways. The name Grayson had become folklore, a ghost story turned courtroom drama. Jack walked in with Clara beside him, her small hand gripping his. She wore a blue dress donated by a neighbor and held her doll close. No one could miss the way the child looked at Jack, like the world made sense as long as he was near. Daniel Grayson sat behind the defense table, hair slicked, suit wrinkled. His smirk vanished the moment Clara entered. He turned pale, shoulders tightening, but it was Jack's eyes, cold and unblinking, that made him shift in his seat. The prosecutor laid out the facts. Heather Grayson fled an abusive marriage. She took her daughter and disappeared into the woods, hiding in an old family cabin. Daniel found them. Heather's body was never recovered until recently, but now they had enough. Remains, eyewitness testimony, motive, and a survivor. And that survivor, barely tall enough for the witness chair, took the stand with her doll in her lap. The courtroom fell to a hush. What's your name? The prosecutor asked. Clara Grayson. And how old are you? 5.5. Do you know why you're here? Clara looked at Jack, who gave her the smallest nod. To tell the truth, she said. The questions were gentle, but they held weight. Clara spoke of the fire, of the yelling, of her mother crying. She spoke of hiding under the bed, of hearing her mommy scream and fall, and of being told to stay inside, that someone would come back. He never came back, she said, but Jack did. The courtroom exhaled. Daniel's lawyer tried to discredit her. Isn't it true, Clara, that sometimes you have nightmares? She nodded. Yes. And sometimes you imagine things? Clara blinked. Yes. But I don't imagine screams, or the way Mommy stopped moving. Silence. Jack clenched his jaw. Every word from Clara cut deeper than the one before. When her testimony ended, she walked back to her seat beside Jack. He wrapped his arm around her as the gallery watched in stunned reverence. Daniel Grayson didn't testify. His lawyer claimed there was nothing to be gained, but the jury didn't need more. After 3 hours of deliberation, they returned with the verdict. Guilty on all counts. Jack didn't smile. Clara didn't cry. But something in her shoulders loosened, as if a weight she'd carried for months had finally lifted. Outside, reporters called to them. Jack shielded her with his coat as they walked down the courthouse steps. Sheriff Tomlin met them at the edge of the square. "She's braver than most men I know," he said. Jack nodded. "She's her mother's daughter." The town held a quiet celebration that weekend, not for vengeance but for justice. The local church rang its bells. Clara was gifted a new pair of shoes. The school offered her a place at the coming fall session. Jack was offered a badge, a deputy position. He refused. "I already have a job," he said, keeping her safe. That night, they returned to the cabin, which had been repaired with help from the community. The walls were solid again, the roof sealed, and flowers planted near the door. It didn't erase the past, but it gave the future something to stand on. Clara ran through the yard with Button barking at her heels. Jack sat on the steps, watching the sky turn gold. When she returned, breathless and pink-cheeked, she climbed into his lap. "You're my dad now, right?" she asked. He smiled, more with his eyes than his mouth. "If you'll have me." She nodded. "I had a dream last night." Mommy smiled. She said I was safe. Jack held her close. "You are. You always will be." As the sun set, they carved a new nameplate for the front door. Clara chose the name. "Monroe," she said proudly. "Like you." Jack traced each letter into the wood, his hands steady. Beneath it he added, "Clara's home." Because it was. Summer arrived with warmth that wrapped the cabin like a promise. Bees buzzed in the garden Clara had planted, rows of crooked sunflowers and wild mint. Jack fixed the porch rail one morning while she hummed a tune passed down from her mother, one she barely remembered but clung to like breath. Every so often townspeople stopped by. The teacher brought books. The baker left fresh bread on the step. But mostly it was just Jack, Clara, and Button. And that was enough. One afternoon, Jack found Clara in the woods behind the cabin, kneeling beside a tree with a small wooden cross placed at its base. It wasn't elaborate, just 2 sticks tied with string and a scattering of daisies underneath. "I made it for her," Clara said when Jack approached. He crouched beside her. "She'd like that. I talk to her sometimes," Clara added. "I'd tell her about you." Jack didn't speak. He simply placed his hand on her shoulder, and together they sat in silence, letting the forest listen. Later that week, a letter arrived from the state. Custody confirmation. The paperwork Jack had filed months earlier had gone through. He was now, legally and officially, Clara's guardian. When he read the final line, "Adoption approved," something in his chest cracked wide open. A dam that had held grief and guilt and fear now released something else, peace. He showed her the papers that night. Clara stared at them, not quite understanding. "It means," he said, "you're mine, forever. No one can take you away." Her eyes lit up. "Really? Really?" She jumped into his arms. "You were always mine." They cried together then. Quiet tears. Cleansing. The next morning, Jack took her to the edge of the lake. They released a small lantern into the water, watching it drift with the current. It carried a note, one Clara had written with Jack's help. "Dear Mommy," it said, "I found someone who stayed." And below it, in smaller handwriting, "I miss you every day." The lantern floated until the horizon swallowed it, and Clara whispered, "Goodbye." But it wasn't the end. It was a beginning. Clara started school that fall. Jack packed her lunch every morning, 2 sandwiches, one always cut in the shape of a star. He walked her to the schoolhouse gate and waited until she turned and waved before disappearing inside. At home, the cabin took on a new rhythm. Laughter echoed off the walls. Drawings covered the fridge. Stories filled the evenings. Sometimes nightmares came, but they didn't stay, because now, when Clara woke in the dark, someone was there. Not a ghost, not a promise, but a man who had once followed smoke through snow and found a reason to live again. As for Jack, he'd never planned for this life. He had run from the world, from loss, from himself. But Clara, small, stubborn, full of light, pulled him back with nothing more than a whispered, "Stay." And so he did. He stayed through storms, through memories, through nights when the fire burned low but never out. Because love, the kind born not of blood, but of choice, is louder than any silence and stronger than any past. In time, their story became legend in Harlan's End. They were the ones who turned tragedy into family, who proved that hope could survive even in an abandoned cabin in the coldest corner of the woods. And if you listen closely, on quiet nights, when the wind is kind and the pines sway gently, you might hear a child's laughter echoing through the valley, carried on the smoke of a home that never gave up. Sometimes, the most unexpected journeys lead us home. Sometimes we stumble into love not through fate, but through fire, forged in hardship, in quiet mornings and steady hands. This is not just a story of survival. It's a story of rebuilding, of showing up when no one else does, of becoming the family someone else is still waiting for. So if your heart ached for Clara, if you felt Jack's quiet strength, if you believe that family is something we choose, not something we're given, then you are exactly where you need to be. Because out here, in the wilderness of life, the only thing stronger than fear is the courage to begin again. Thank you for watching this video. Please subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you'll know when we post our next story. See you in the next one.